On August 4th, 1892, two people were brutally murdered with an axe in Fall River, Massachusetts. The prime suspect, a 32-year-old Sunday school teacher named Lizzie Borden.
You may think you know the Lizzie Borden case, but today I'm going to talk about 5 obvious facts that are completely false.
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41.
Hello, my Silky friends. If you are new to this channel, I'm Silky. This is Silky Southern Tea, and here we dig deep into cases and crimes that keep us up at night. Today, we're starting a series that's going to completely change how you see America's most notorious murder case. You see, Lizzie Borden's story has some obvious facts that everyone just accepts as true, such as the sweltering heat that helped drive her to murder, her father's stinginess that caused desperation, her hatred for her stepmother, and most of all, maybe her cold, emotionless response. Meanwhile, her uncle had the perfect alibi that totally cleared him from suspicion. Now, the problem is that every single one of these facts is a total lie. And today I'm going to prove it to you with actual evidence that's been sitting in plain sight for 130 years. So grab your britches, because by the end of this episode, you're going to realize that everything that you knew about this case is wrong. And sweetheart, this is just the beginning. So let's talk about myth number 1, the sweltering heat. Now, this is the most pervasive myth that August 4th, 1892 was a brutally hot day that drove Lizzie to the breaking point. The problem is that it's just not true. But it's been repeated in every documentary, every book, every movie. The oppressive heat, this stifling Victorian house, the pressure cooker atmosphere, all this finally exploded into violence. Except the actual weather records, they say the high temperature that day was somewhere between 78 and 80 degrees. Y'all, that's not sweltering. Alabama's sweltering. That's not even oppressive, not even for New England. That is a nice summer day. Now, let's take into consideration that they are close to the river, so you would probably have a little bit more humidity, but still, it is not sweltering. It is not that hot, certainly not the hottest day of the year. So, where did this myth come from? I'm glad you asked. That was brought up by the prosecution during the trial. Yes, that was the narrative he built. It was the hottest day of the year, except it wasn't. Okay, and this just made it impossible for Lizzie to be in the barn looking for anything because of the sweltering heat. What doesn't make sense is that no one seemed to remember that it wasn't hot, or at least excessively hot. So, why do people buy into this? Well, it makes a great story, right? It drove her into this frenzy. Except there wasn't enough heat to make anyone crazy. So let's move on to myth number 2, that Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, was a stingy, miserly man. Well, he might have been in business. There is some truth to that part. But was he with his daughters? No, ma'am. Now, the prosecution wants you to believe that Lizzie and Emma were being treated poorly. Their father was rich, but they were made to act like paupers. And that's just not the truth. Okay, first of all, Andrew Borden sent Emma to college, which in those days was kind of superfluous because a woman really didn't do anything. Even if she had a college degree, she was not expected to work outside the home. So getting an education, it looked good on paper, it was expensive, but that's basically all it was good for. Certainly, if Andrew was the skinflint that history wants us to think he wouldn't have spent money on that. Another thing to consider is that Lizzie took a grand tour of Europe, paid for by Andrew Borden. She spent about 4 months just touring all of the countries, living it up. There wasn't any expense spared there. So, where does all of this miserliness come in? I mean, let's think about it. Emma and Lizzie, they had their dresses made by milliners. Like they were handmade, hand tailored. Lizzie, in spite of what you may have heard, was quite a figure in the community. She was always going and doing, she was in the public eye, and she dressed accordingly. Okay? Maybe it wasn't as ostentatious, maybe as she was in later years, but certainly she did not walk around in rags and she was perfectly acceptable to Victorian society. Something else to consider is that while Andrew was so miserly, he gave them a house. Long story short, he gave a house to Emma and Lizzie to rent out, to collect rents from. All right. Now, the house was worth about $3,000. The girls kept it for a couple of years and then, they got tired of the upkeep. There was always something going wrong, the tenants, whatever. So, after a couple of years, Emma and Lizzie decided they wanted out of the business. Let me remind you that Andrew gave them the property. They did not buy it from him. But when they wanted to give it back to him, he bought it from Lizzie and Emma for $5,000. That's 2,000 more than it was actually worth a few years prior. And of course, they split the money. So, if this was such a problem, and Andrew was really such a skinflint with his daughters, he wouldn't have done that. Yes, it's true that they did not live in the fashionable part of town, and that is something else that's going to come up. But they did have indoor plumbing, and although they didn't have all of the amenities that the richer people, and certainly they could afford, this was something that was in the works, in the plan. And although they didn't live in the richest part of town, they weren't in the poor part of town either. Okay. They were in the business district where Andrew wanted to live because he walked to all of his businesses. It makes sense, right? Furthermore, there was no reason for Lizzie to have killed for money because she was already going to inherit what he had. Now, it was going to be divided, I assume, between her and Emma and his wife, Abby. But still, he had plenty of money to go around. And I mean, come on, he wasn't a spring chicken. It could only be so much longer, and she would inherit anyway. The historical records show that Andrew Borden was generous with his daughters, even to the point that some family members, quote, Mr. Harrington, thought that they were a little bit spoiled, overindulged. So, where did this myth come from? Again, it's made up narrative to try to fit the puzzle pieces together as to why Lizzie would commit this crime. Let's go to myth number 3. Lizzie hated Abby. Okay, first of all, let's go back to when Abby first came to the Borden household. Lizzie was around 4 years old, Emma was around 14. Emma had given her solemn promise to her mom before she died that she would be Lizzie's caretaker. So, in Emma's head, Lizzie was her child. Emma and Lizzie would later say things about Abby is like she just didn't seem to be that interested in them. Now, she didn't have other kids, so maybe she didn't know how to be a stepmother, but certainly there was an animosity between them. In fact, when Emma went to college, Lizzie and Abby grew much closer. However, they did have their differences. Now, Lizzie always called Abby mother up until a certain time, about 5 years prior to the murders. And while this did have to do with a rift over money, because Andrew had given a house to Abby's sister, when Lizzie became upset, this is when Andrew gave her and Emma the house that they rented out for a while. Now, all the testimony of Bridget and other people in the household say that there wasn't any screaming fights, anything unkind between Lizzie and Abby. And when Lizzie was asked, she said that she didn't call her mother because she didn't want to. She called her Mrs. Borden. But let me also say that in this particular time period, it was customary for children to not in public call their parents mother or father, but Mr. and Mrs. Borden. Even for a wife, she would usually refer to her husband as Mr. Borden. It was a respect thing, kind of different than the way we do it today. And now, according to Lizzie's own testimony, she called Abby Mrs. Borden most of the time, but she did still call her mother at times. And the prosecution asked her to her face, and she's like, yeah. Like, she did call her mother, but she called her Mrs. Borden more often. Were they the best of friends and like this? No, they weren't. But just because you are not close with your stepmother doesn't mean that you are going to kill her, right? But see, this tongue started wagging, and there were reports of different things that Lizzie said. And when we get into the culture of Lizzie, I'm going to explain to you why I think most of it is just complete hogwash. Um, and many things that were said were later proved to be untrue. So the bottom line is, were they the best of friends? No, but they weren't mortal enemies either. It was the normal friction between family members. And don't tell me you don't have a family member that you're not the fondest of, because I know that's not true. But let's go on. The fourth thing that we always hear is John Morse. Now remember, this is Uncle John that was there, had come in the day before and was gone during the time of the murders, but showed up quickly afterwards. Uncle John had an airtight alibi, right? Or else they would have pursued it, being that he was a man and more likely had the strength to commit these crimes. Well, actually, that is a big myth. Not only did John Morse not have an airtight alibi, which we will talk about in depth, but he also changed his story, the lies, the craziness. I mean, it's unparalleled. When you actually examine his alibi with a fine tooth comb, it completely falls apart. He says he left the house at around 8:45 a.m. and didn't come back until 11:45 or thereabouts. But there is a big crack in his alibi because an innocent statement by his niece completely broke that timeline. All right? And although I'm not going to get into the details right now, let me go ahead and tell you that according to his niece, who thought she was helping him, she made a statement about John Morse and Dr. Bowen not having crossed, in other words, been at her house at the same time. If that is true, that completely blows John Morse's alibi. He had to leave way before the time he said, which he said he left at 11:20. No, he had to be gone much earlier than that. Plus, there is a whole nother witness statement that police overlooked, but that will be later in this series. So let's go to the fifth myth that we're going to talk about today, and that is Lizzie's reaction. And this was kind of catastrophic for her. She was known as what we would call the ice queen today. Like, was so unemotional, and this really bothered people. And this is how she was painted in the media and in court. But what was the actual truth? Well, it was nothing of the sort. Here's what they didn't tell you. She wasn't emotionless, not at all. The actual witnesses, they tell a different story. Dr. Seabury Bowen, Seabury, I don't know. It's an interesting name. We don't have them like that today. But he was the family physician who came shortly after Andrew's body was discovered. Now, he testified that Lizzie was very much affected and crying. As a matter of fact, she was so upset that he later gave her medicine, not only for her headache, but he started her on morphine from that very day and went all through the inquest. That is a whole can of worms right there. But I want to tell you something. If I was all doped up on morphine, I would probably be emotionless too. But let's look at some other witnesses who also testified about her emotional state. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, testified that Lizzie was crying and moaning when she first saw her after the discovery. And Alice Russell, who was Lizzie's friend, And we'll talk about that weird friendship later on. But she stated that Lizzie was much affected and weeping. So, multiple witnesses described Lizzie as crying, distressed, and clearly affected by the tragedy. But somehow these first-hand accounts, they get twisted into she showed no emotion. Now, there are some other people who helped with that narrative, and we will also talk about that later in the series because you're not going to believe what the police said. And why didn't anybody address this? I don't know, but we're going to talk about it. Now, I want to tell you something. As a nurse, just looking at trauma response, you cannot judge how a person grieves. I can tell you trauma affects people differently. Sometimes people are, just completely off the chain. I mean, wild expressions of grief. And some, probably like Lizzie, are in shock. And you can't judge how a person feels by the emotions that they are displaying in this case. I mean, some people cry, some people shut down, some people go into shock. It's all over the place. But Lizzie's completely normal trauma response was twisted into evidence of being guilty. Of course, by the people who already decided she was guilty. So, how did these myths become so entrenched into history? Well, what I've learned is once a narrative takes hold, it is incredibly hard to change. People see what they expect to see, and they interpret evidence through the lens that they already believe. And in Lizzie's case, the narrative was set early. Every piece of evidence was interpreted to fit the narrative, even when the evidence actually contradicted it. So now that we are clearing away these lies and myths, we can start looking at what actually happened on August 4th of 1892. And when you examine the real evidence, the timeline, the physical impossibilities, and overlooked testimony, a completely different story emerges. A story where Lizzie Borden isn't the killer, but most likely a terrified witness who knew exactly who the real murderer was. So, next time we are going to dive into the timeline of that morning, and I'm going to show you why it was physically impossible for Lizzie to have committed these murders. We're talking about evidence that is so clear, so undeniable, that it should have ended this case 130 years ago. And I'm going to tell you something. If one woman had been able to be at that inquest or on the grand jury, this trial would never have happened. But here's what I need you to do. First, if you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and the like button, because this series is going to change completely how you see this case. The second thing, in the comments, let me know which of these myths shocked you the most, and did you know about Dr. Bowen's testimony that Lizzie was indeed crying? And the third thing is, if you want the complete story, all the evidence, all my analysis, and all of the proof of Lizzie's innocence in detail, then check out my book, Lizzie Borden, The Lies Behind the Legend. I'm going to leave a link in the description below because that book was born just from me trying to study and present this case here on this platform, and it just got wild. The more I studied, the more mind-blowing stuff I found. So until next time, you keep digging for the truth in everything, because some of the biggest lies are the ones that everyone believes. I will see you next time for the second episode, which is going to be the impossible timeline. And don't forget to stay safe out there. But whatever you do, just stay silky. Bye-bye.